Hello and welcome to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. We have big ideas to discuss this week because free speech on climate change at our universities and free speech on just about anything else is under threat, it seems, after the federal court overturned the original decision in the Peter Ridd case. So, of course, we'll be talking about the case, what it means for Peter and what it means for free speech on important issues of intellectual inquiry. We'll also be taking a look at a related set of law reforms to do with defamation law in this country. We've seen some big payouts lately. Has this been stifling free speech? Has it been actually one of the things killing off our media giants and stopping them running stories of public interest? So we want to talk about that. And finally, we'll be looking at working from home and remote work. Is it fair to say, people, that the joy of doing so has worn off and companies around the world are now starting to realise the hits to productivity and what it's actually mean for taking on graduates and trying to train them up? Can that even be done in a remote environment? So it's very important issues for the younger generation in how we deal with that. As usual, in our Books and Culture segment, we'll be looking at the latest and greatest, although it's a bit of a flashback to start with. It's the Foxy Ladies of Fountain Lakes. We'll be talking about Kath and Kim and taking us right back to John Howard's Australia. So we'll be looking at that. We also have the historian Anne Applebaum's latest book called Twilight of Democracy. And then I'll be revisiting a book I mentioned on the podcast a few weeks ago, which is Rick Wilson's Running with the Devil, the Republican operative's book on how to defeat Trump. And I'll explain that seeming contradiction when we get to that. But first of all, I'd like to welcome my co-host all the way over here on the main screen, Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott.
Chris, great to have you. And also welcoming to the studio for the first time since he was awarded the Young Libertarian of the Year award at the Friedman Conference, none other than our Director of Policy, Gideon Rozner.
Thank you so much, Scott, and it's great to be here. And of course, a great honour to win the Young Libertarian of the Year award at the Outstanding Friedman Conference, that's a Freudian slip, to which Berg contributed so much as well. So well done, Chris.
Yes, no, it was a great event and well deserved, Gideon, for the efforts that you've made above and beyond to further the cause of freedom in this country.
Thank you.
But as we say, speaking of freedom, Peter Ridd, sadly, it's been a case of one step forward, two steps back. Initial victory in the federal Circuit Court, but now a 2-1 judgment in favour of James Cook University in the federal court. Chris, do you just want to bring us up to date with what happened there, and then we'll discuss what it means for Australia?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. So as you pointed out, James Cook won their appeal against a judgment that had been found in favour of Peter Ridd. Peter, as listeners will well know, and we had a special episode with Peter a year or so ago, was fired by James Cook University in 2018 for criticising the views of his colleagues in the press or criticising the research of some other employees at JCU. The Federal Circuit Court awarded him $1.2 million in compensation, arguing that would be had been a dismissal in violation of his contract. Unfortunately, now a full bench of the federal court has reversed that. I read in the newspapers this morning, and I'll ask Gideon to talk about this, that Peter has declared that he's going to take the case to the High Court. Gideon, obviously you've been really involved and following this case closely. Why don't I just throw to you, what's, first of all, your take? What are the issues at stake here, and what's the next steps?
So my take is that I knew that losing was a possibility, and for various reasons, it was a not insignificant possibility. But the judgment itself, look, it was a 2-1 judgment. The dissenting judgment by Justice Rangier was quite strong and certainly leaves it open to a High Court challenge. But my overall take is, as Scott said, this is obviously a setback, but there are enough flaws in the judgment, I think, to make a good go of coming back in the High Court. And as you said, Peter Ridd is appealing to the High Court. In fact, his GoFundMe GoFundMe page was reopened last night, and now already at 10 o'clock in the morning, it's already up to $150,000 in small donations. So people are very, very fired up. I think that's probably the best jumping off point to talk about why the Rid case matters and why so many people are
So before we
resonating
go back
with
to
it.
that, can I just talk a little bit about the High Court challenge? So one of the questions that I've had about this is that I think this is a hugely significant case for intellectual freedom, and it's a hugely significant case for free speech in general and academic freedom. Of course, I've got a deep interest in that as an academic. But is it an interesting case from the High Court's perspective? Because obviously the High Court is going to hear cases that it thinks not just are in public interest, but have a particular legal principle that is unresolved, that could be resolved through the case. Do you think that this meets that criteria? Is there reasons for optimism in that sense?
I absolutely do, and you're right, that's an important point. The first step in the High Court challenge will be to get leave to appeal, to get the High Court to actually agree to hear it. But there is, and I had a piece in the Australian today actually talking about this point, that not only is it in the public interest, but it is a test case in effect, because there's never been a High Court case that examines the meaning of the words intellectual freedom and academic freedom, which are of course contained in Peter's enterprise agreement or his employment contract, and on which his case is based. So there is an important discussion to be had, especially now in an era of cancel culture and the problems we are having with universities, and what the IPA will call the free speech campus plaguing our universities. I would be extraordinarily surprised if the High Court, even if they're not inclined to find in Peter's favour, or if they don't find in Peter's favour, eventually will not at least hear the case. There are important issues of law and indeed principle that need to be ventilated. And I think if you were sitting on the High Court, from their point of view, of course you'd want to opine on what will be the landmark case, probably for some time, on academic and intellectual freedom.
Yeah, Chris. So I had a bit of a read of the judgment last night, and obviously no expert, but take a keen interest in these matters. And the fact is, the issues that Gideon's talking about were discussed at length in the judgment. So in one sense, this is narrowly turns on a point of employment law about whether or not the clause that protects intellectual freedom at the university overrides the code of conduct, which is the essence of Peter's stance. But in the judgment, the majority do go to some lengths to talk about these related concepts of intellectual freedom and academic freedom, and in so doing, essentially find them, certainly the notion of academic freedom, to have almost gone by the wayside. They make a point which actually may well be true, that in the rush of the Dawkins reforms and the industrialisation of universities under the Hawke government in the 1980s, notions of tenure went out the window. Any distinction between professorial staff and other academic staff went out the window. Which is good for you, Chris, because you and Sinclair Davidson are on the same level, because you're both academics, even though...
I mean, I always thought that, but...
even though he's a professor and you're not.
Legally.
Yeah, that's right. So they certainly observe these things, but they're not mourning them. They're essentially saying that because they're no longer enlivened by acts in Parliament or enterprise agreements or the Fair Work Act, that they no longer have any relevance, and to the extent that they do, they quote Professor Jennifer Lackey in her book on academic freedom, saying that really what's happened is now we've got an age of social media, different things have happened. Look, it's not really the thing anymore, to paraphrase. They didn't say quite like that.
I mean, I want to just dwell on that a bit, because there is this paragraph in the judgment that I think is very revealing. I'm not sure whether it would constitute the basis of a High Court challenge. In fact, I'm certain it wouldn't. But it is very revealing about the way that at least these particular judges and potentially much of the legal profession thinks about academic freedom. And I'll quote, if you don't mind, they write that there is little to be gained in resorting to historical concepts and definitions of academic freedom. Whatever the concept once meant, it has evolved to take into account contemporary circumstances which presents a challenge to it, including the internet, social media, and trolling. none of which inform the views of persons such as John Stuart Mill, John Locke, Isaiah Berlin, and others who've written on the topic. Now, this is a pretty big statement that we cannot refer to our socially evolved understandings of the importance of freedom of speech because there's trolling on social media. And, as someone who's done a fair bit of work in the history of freedom of speech, I can't help but just completely reject that claim if we don't have the ideas of freedom of speech underpinning any legal construct of freedom of speech, then we're floating freely without any foundational support.
And Gideon, please take it up. But when you say the word there is evolve, but the point is the way they describe it, they actually believe it's been evolved out of existence, so far as I can tell. It's evolved to the point where it actually has no relevance.
There's your point. There's your point, which is that there's the really practical reform changes about the university sector that meant there's none of these romantic concepts like tenure that still exist in other university systems, but they don't exist in Australia. So academics are just employees. They can be fired according to standard industrial relations law. But on the other hand, there's also, their argument goes further. Those romantic ideas like academic freedom don't actually have evolved to not add much value. Now, that they might be right on the law, but the principle behind academic freedom, the principle behind free speech, of which academic freedom is related to, is enduring and necessary. And to see a court dismiss them so simply is a huge concern.
Well, Dara McDonald made this point to me when the judgment came out.
Our IPA colleague.
Oh, yes, our IPA colleague, research fellow Dara McDonald, who works in our legal rights team. She made, we were all poring over the judgment when it came out, and we were struck by this extraordinary. It was paragraph 94 that Chris was referring to. This extraordinary aside, and Chris is right. It didn't substantively form part of the reasoning in a huge sense, but it did give an insight into the court's thinking. Dara said to me, in an age of Twitter mobs and cancel culture, academic freedom and the related free speech is more important than ever. We need those guarantees more important than ever. But what it shows is the extent to which the cancel culture ethic has corroded not just our universities, but it's spreading to other institutions, not least of all one of the highest courts in the land. We are on the verge of giving the cancel culture in all its forms and incarnations legal recognition here. I think this is a really, really frightening insight. And
at the risk of sounding like Dennis Denuto taking the Kerrigans to the High Court, I do feel like paragraph 94, as you say, it's not key to the judgment. But in some ways, these are precisely the issues that the High Court might be interested in.
Yeah.
Certainly with the Theophanous case, which I think was 90s, which was about the implied freedom of political communication. It's had a sort of a vexed history since, I understand, but certainly that was a High Court that was willing to say that there are some general principles underpinning the Australian democracy and Australian institutions that, whether or not they're in the statute, do enliven those statutes and should guide us. And one wonders whether this isn't relevant to that kind of a case.
Yeah,
I'll take the opportunity just to point out something that bugs me, that this is a really strong, clear instance of. It's the habit that a lot of senior judges have of opining about the theory of freedom of speech and the philosophy of freedom of speech, and whether John Stuart Mill, for example, has resonance today. The one that really bugged me, and this is nowhere near as bad as others I've seen, but the Finkelstein review into the independent review into media regulation, which had pages and pages of this incredibly amateurish philosophizing about the relevance of John Stuart Mill and how, no, it's not important today, or, oh no, he meant something totally different. It's always it's always undergraduate level analysis pumped out by incredibly senior people. And it is a huge concern because it shows how little many senior members of the legal profession understand about the philosophy that underpins some of the laws that they are supposed to be interpreting.
I want to qualify my remarks as well, because I don't think we should write this off necessarily as just an aside and just an obiter dictum in effect. I think this is important, because this is not a case about the interpretation of a modern tax statute or something. I mean, this is a case that turned on, the point that's been made, it's a workplace relations dispute, but that it may very well be. But the clause that the action was brought under was a clause literally expressly guaranteeing intellectual freedom. You cannot interpret that in a vacuum, and you cannot interpret that, certainly in a philosophical vacuum, but you cannot interpret it without a reference to the 1,000-year history of a university, and this is a point Stuart Wood made in his closing argument in the Federal Circuit Court hearing. You need to consider the context of that guarantee, and you cannot do that without reference to the mission of a university historically, and where academic freedom fits into that, and what the purpose of a university is. I mean, the other disturbing thing about this judgment is that, and about the way this is going, is it in a de facto sense endorses the view of a university as a degree factory and a grant bucket.
Just another state-owned industrial facility.
Correct, exactly. A state-owned corporation, in effect. I mean, I think that is... Look, if we have that view of public universities, we may as well flog them off and privatise them. There's no the only argument.
Here.
Well, yeah. Here. I mean, look, that's not the question too.
So they are private. Then to push back against that, the government does a lot of subsidising of students, but it doesn't subsidise the universities except through research.
Oh, yes, it does. Oh, well, exactly. Well, why do we do that?
But then in the judgment, Chris, I mean, you make a reasonable point, and indeed academic freedom, as the judges say, institutional autonomy is part of that. That's another sense of academic freedom. But then they have to make reference to Queensland's Public Sector Ethics Act, in as much as, whatever else we say about James Cook University, it's still established by state statute and is subject to state legislation governing all, state-established organisations. So it's this ridiculous hybrid system that we've got, which is essentially cut universities loose from any form of accountability.
And I think, I think the problem is going to get more challenging. So I don't really agree with everything, but to advance the conversation a little bit, I think that it's going to get more challenging, because what Peter was doing was trying to take his research and use it to influence public discussion about his research, which of course is of great interest to the Australian community, because it's about the Great Barrier Reef and cultural icon and so forth. But the government now explicitly requires universities to do that sort of what you'd call impact and engagement work. And we're going to find more and more instances of academics being told and being instructed to deliberately go out there and have public debate. And when those public debates end up controversial, or when they end up, pressing buttons that people are uncomfortable with, then suddenly it's going to become an industrial relations issue. Well, now, I know a lot of academics aren't very comfortable with doing that, and I think the universities are going to discover that is actually a very uncomfortable thing to have thousands of freelance commentators wandering around the country talking about controversial matters.
This is why it's also a political issue as well as whatever. And we certainly do hope that the High Court does allow the appeal and actually hear the substantive matter, because these are vital issues. But it's also within the political realm, because in the situation you describe, we've on this show, on Looking Forward, we've interviewed Peter, of course, a terrific interview. On the IPA website, you can find Gideon's podcast for Heretic, which gives you all the background. But we've also talked at length about the French review, which was commissioned by the Minister for Education, Dan Tehan. Well done, Dan. And Justice French, of course, didn't get everything right, and he denied that there was any kind of a crisis. But he nevertheless did say that action was necessary, and that there needed to be a model code of conduct on academic freedom that would override other university policies and procedures. And the point I made at the time is, and this court case has proven, is industrial law is a very, very thin foundation for something as important as academic freedom. It shouldn't just be up to individual enterprise agreements, and God bless the NTEU for fighting to keep it, but it's very haphazard and it's under threat. It is time for Dan Teen to revisit French and what universities have actually done because with one exception, they've done very little. They've got a little bit of window dressing there. They've changed some policies at different universities. But as Greg Craven, the Vice-Chancellor of Australian Catholic University, has pointed out in the pages of the Australian just in the last few days, his university is the only one that's actually elevated academic freedom to something protected by a university statute and not just buried in a policy where it has to compete with other policies. So there is scope now, regardless of and not waiting on the High Court, for what would you say, take a militant approach to implementation of the French reforms. That's what I'd like to see.
Can I just raise a mild objection to that I think can be resolved? I mean, we've argued many times on this podcast that it is very important to allow people to sign contracts with organizations from a workplace relations perspective that may constrain their ability to speak. We may not like them, and we might not recommend people sign those contracts, but freedom of contract is one of the most important economic rights that we have. We don't want any government interference in that right. Now, the question might be then, well, to what extent are universities actually creatures of the state, so they have a higher burden that they have to pass? They have higher duties that they have to the state itself to facilitate good things like academic freedom and intellectual freedom. But I'm skeptical about that. I admit that it is a blurry issue and that the margin, universities are not fully private. But at the same time, I don't want the government to be dictating any more than the NTU does my industrial relations. I don't want Dan Tien to write my contract, right? Any more than I want my quote union representatives to write my contract.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think, but they already do. I mean, as this case makes clear, it's the relevant provisions of the Fair Work Act which we're applying here. The enterprise agreement, actually, the risk of diving into the judgment, they're making the point that the enterprise agreement is not really an agreement between the university and the union on behalf of the employees. It is in effect a subordinate instrument of the Fair Work Act and is a legislative instrument. So a reasonable objection on philosophical grounds, but I don't think it actually bears any relation to the law as it stands, Chris.
Well, that's my specialty, okay. Scott. So.
Yeah, I just want to tease this out though, Chris. I mean, you seem to be there seems to be a bit of an ambivalence on whether universities are private entities and whether there's a role for the state in dictating their operations. But I mean, my view is pretty clear. I mean, as long as we give billions of dollars a year to them in tuition fees and also research grants, the research grants to me is especially problematic. We cannot. The purpose of a university, and again, speaking as a non-academic, is to create these places where the ideas, the good, the bad, and the ugly, can be ventilated freely. The bad ones are defeated in the battle of ideas, and the good ones are elevated and become new understandings and new truths and new discoveries. I don't think we're getting our money's worth as taxpayers unless there's some guarantee that all ideas can come to the table. Because and the end result of the dynamic that I'm speaking about is that is a Peter Ridd situation. It's a situation in which there's an intellectual monoculture and universities are becoming more and more removed from relevance and the concerns and the interests of of the population. I don't think it's a good idea to have our public institutions isolated from the public in this way.
Yeah, Chris, and I might actually give Gideon the last word there.
All right.
Because it was.
I was asking a question in my typically long-winded way.
Oh, I was going to take that question as a statement. But,
yeah.
All right, Chris, write a reply and then we'll move on to defamation.
I'm genuinely interested, though. I mean, this is an interesting...
No. Look. I fully admit that it's an ambiguous situation in part because of those research grants. I will, without engaging your entire point out that a lot of research that's done by universities is not paid for by the federal government. A lot of the research that's done by the universities is paid for by international student revenue.
Yeah.
Now,
that have another conversation about that,
of course. But it's not like the university research environment would not exist if it wasn't for the fact that they are allowed to apply for ARC grants. And again, also those ARC grants are distributed unevenly across the sector. Some universities get the bulk of them, like Monash and Melbourne and the group of 8 universities. Some universities don't get, the smaller universities don't get much at all. So I think it is more complicated than that, but I really have to push back very hard against the idea that they are just state institutions of the state and should be regulated in the way we would regulate, the Army or the Department of Education or something.
Well, let's hope the High Court gets to rule on that at some point, and that we actually get a better outcome for Peter Ridd, who is a terrific bloke fighting the good fight on important issues. Okay, Chris, you did get the last word on that segment. But until the next time that we get Gideon back to update on progress on this very important issue, as I say, if you want more information, please do go to ipa.org.au. You can learn more about what we've written about Peter's case. It'll link through to his GoFundMe page. You can have a look at The Heretic, and if you want to support the work of the IPA on these issues, you can do that as well at our donate page. But it is time to talk about another free speech related issue, Chris, which is defamation law reform.
That's right. So earlier this week, the Council of Attorneys General announced a fairly wide-ranging reform of Australia's model defamation laws. So defamation is technically under the Constitution a matter for the states, but because no one cares about the Constitution anymore, it all gets run out of Canberra. And the Attorneys General get together and the Commonwealth distributes a model defamation law. Our defamation law is a bit outdated. Well, not just a bit, but quite archaic. And the proposals in front of the each state now are to adopt some changes to better deal with a world of social media and so forth. We've been talking about defamation law reform since last year when Christian Porter, the federal Attorney General, proposed to make social media outlets liable for defamation and other speech crimes committed on their platforms. This proposal seems to have avoided that, which I think is good. But there are some other interesting parts of it. But more generally, I think, Gideon, we've talked about this a bit in the past. I think Australians don't understand how unique our defamation environment is, do they?
Yeah, no, they don't. And I was initially pretty ambivalent on defamation law until a few years ago when I had to consider it in the light of the Geoffrey Rush decision and so on. But yeah, Australia is one of the most litigant-friendly jurisdictions in the world. In fact, we are a destination for jurisdiction shopping, so people who feel aggrieved and want the best chance of winning can choose to sue in Australia as opposed to the United Kingdom or some other place. And that's going to, I'd imagine, ramp up even more in an era of globalized media and social media and various other phenomena. But look, I mean, as a broad response to this, I think this is a really good move. It's not everything I would have wanted, which is to see defo law scrapped outright. But it's true. I mean, as we've discussed previously, Chris, defamation. I see the. And it's a genuine ethical dilemma whether you have a proprietary right in your in your reputation, and whether somebody deliberately inflicting economic harm on you by ruining your reputation is an actionable cause. But on a practical level, there is a huge access to justice issue here, because typically, the reality of going to court, as we well know from the Peter Ridd case, is such that if you either don't have money or you can't raise $1 million or so from a GoFundMe page, you can't go to court. So typically, defamation law ends up being a vehicle for either rich people to sue other rich people who they feel aggrieved and have insulted them, or alternatively, it's a platform for rich people to sue some poor journalist working for the Associated Press or something, ruining their life so they can get a new kitchen. I think the practical consequences of defamation law are pretty bad for free speech, given that it can. Every time I go on Sky News or something like that, I have the sort of Damocles in the form of a defamation rap hanging over my head, not necessarily just because I want to defame people deliberately, but it's always an issue when you're talking on live TV that you might say something that our very generous defamation laws can accommodate and facilitate, and mean that I'll have to smash the piggy bank and worry about how I'll pay out a claim. So it's a real and live issue. But the good news is that this package takes particular note of the fact that social media is opening up a new avenue for people to sue for defo, and it seems to be aimed at the Dylan Voller case, which found that the Daily Telegraph and other publications were liable for things that random people posted on their Facebook page. I mean, how is freedom of expression possible at all if you're worrying about something as out of your control as that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, and that was the understated origin of what Christian Porter was talking about last year, with the expansion of defamation to social media cases, because the common law seemed to have prevented Facebook from being sued, but allowed the Daily Telegraph to be sued for things on Facebook, which was a very unclear judgment. I hope that judgment will be revisited. This proposal seems to do some helpful things, not directly tackling that, but for example, it will prevent people from suing for defamation over comments that have been published in perpetuity online. And so the statement is that plaintiffs will have just 1 year to sue from the date that material is first posted. And there have historically been some really interesting cases about someone might tweet something and it gets retweeted, and so you can sue everyone who retweets it or likes it, or something along those lines, because that's counted as a new instance of publication, which of course could go on forever. So there's some cleaning up things. I think what's most appealing about this, though, is what appears to be a much deeper strengthening of a public interest test in defamation, that a defamatory statement will, a defense to a charge of defamation will be that the publication was in the public interest. That is something that Australian law has really struggled with and has created some serious problems too. On the broad point, I think you're absolutely right, Gideon. I have serious problems with defamation, but those serious problems we can put aside the philosophy. In practice, defamation is a deeply unequal law that is used by people who are wealthy enough to sue for defamation in the first place. And in my view, if you're wealthy enough to sue for defamation, you are also wealthy enough to defend yourself in the public sphere. And I've yet to see a case where that objection didn't.
Chris, just before we go on, I just want to pick apart this public interest test idea. I don't like it when I hear public interest tests mentioned in the course of law reform, because typically what it seems the case is being made by journalists who want exemption for all sorts of laws to publish in the public interest, and by implication, those laws will give special privileges to journalists that aren't available to the public. I mean, I don't know much about the jurisprudence of it, but I'm interested to know how public interest is defined. But again, to go back to my substantive point, rather than creating carve-outs for things that may or may not be in the public interest, which is such a vague term, I can't see it, a working definition of it to be particularly strong or even possible. I would much rather defo law, as I said, just get scrapped outright than starting to poke holes in it. What's your view on that, Chris?
Yeah, let me give you a defense of public interest in this case. I'm deeply concerned about vagaries in laws when that vagary leads to punishment. But if this is a vague, open-ended defense against a defamation charge, I don't think it's as objectionable. Of course, public interest is in the eye of the beholder. The word public interest empowers judges and lawyers to really say whatever they want. In this case, though, as a defense to protect freedom of speech, I'm very happy with a open, broad thing that can be used in as many ways as possible.
Yeah, just one more observation.
I take your point, but I think it's less objectionable.
Just one more thing. I think the stronger measure in it to me is the new threshold of serious harm. I think that that's more likely to be clear and have some sort of reliable.
So just talk us through that.
Yeah. So there's a new standard to sue for defamation. I think under all circumstances, or certainly in some circumstances, but you can't access compensation for defamation unless you can prove serious harm, as opposed to what the standard was before, which is presumably just harm or some damage to reputation.
Unserious harm.
Yeah, trivial harm or funny harm. So I think that,
and because one of the things that they've identified in the research that led to the ministers making this decision is the proliferation of small, punter-to-punter claims, essentially, not necessarily famous people or anything. As a result of social media, the principal who sued a parent for something said on a social media group, I don't know whether that was an example of a frivolous claim, but that would be caught by the threshold. But claims of that nature have been, quote, clogging up the courts, unquote.
Correct.
And this is what this threshold seems to be designed to deal with.
It gets me off the hook because I've only been threatened with one defo rap once by someone on Twitter because I said they were a drunk, and true, there's a defence for defamation, but also, that's not particularly serious harm.
Well, this is the other thing that this is introducing.
Not to this person's reputation anyway.
Which is, I'm very interested in this idea also of concern notices and offers to make amends. They seem to be providing a process for something, and, I've spoken to a defamation lawyer about this, that it has increasingly been the practice in recent years, even while, there's the lure of big bucks if you take something all the way to the court, that it's almost a normalisation of the process of, oi, what's this on your website, what got published? I'm not very happy about that. And a publisher will have a look at it, or a social media platform will have a look at it, and they might well go, okay, sorry, that imputation was inadvertent. We will, or wrong. We accept that we were wrong. We'll immediately apologise. We'll take it down, etc., etc., etc. And that's enough, and it goes away. And what they seem to be doing I
remember in our defo seminar, that was the advice in first instance.
just apologise.
Yeah, grovelling apologies go a long way. And what they seem to be making that process even easier, so that the courts don't even need to be involved at that stage, and that could deal also with a lot of these, smaller.
But it's not good, right, Scott? So I agree, and the advice as a public commentator is always, the legal advice is you should just apologise so that you're not caught up in the courts. But that is not healthy for a open speaking democracy, to have to immediately back down if you say something that is controversial or might offend someone.
But I think it's good though, because it lowers the bar to actually publishing in the first time, because this comes to free speech. The reason why, and this is the public interest issue, is you don't want to create a climate in which the default position will be to not publish. So this is why we're wary of social media platforms being caught, because the easiest thing to do is to turn off comments. And pragmatically, what has been happening is that newspapers, who aren't exactly making buckets of money at the moment, have to pay millions of dollars in insurance. They have a very small budget to fight a small number of claims. So of the universe of possible stories that they might publish, and then they, it's the old notion of the fourth estate. They actually do uncover things which the public should know about. But if the bar is too high and they don't publish, the public misses out. Democracy is ill served. So I think something that makes it a little bit more straightforward to publish without envisaging all the catastrophic consequences that might follow is a good thing. And that I think this package goes somewhat towards. It's no surprise, of course, that the The publishers have been lobbying very hard on this and are very happy with it, and it does seem to go to that old notion of the media as fourth estate. But in this case, I don't think that's a bad thing. It's part of
I take your point, Scott. Why don't we conclude with that?
Oh, you mean I get the last word this time?
You get the last word.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, good.
We'll share it. Gideon, you get the last word next.
We want to share it around.
Yippee.
And then, Chris, I did mention at the top of the show that we were going to talk about the joy of working from home and remote work has started to wear off.
It has. You see, so this isn't really a policy question. Obviously, it's driven by, it's a consequence of the policy.
It's a cultural
that has sent
question.
us all home, and a consequence of the lockdowns and the pandemic and so forth. But Google has now announced, in fact, the other day it announced that the majority of its global staff will remain working from home until at least July 2021, so another 12 months minimum. Facebook has quite prominently announced that it's preparing for many of its staff to be permanent working from home. I think that this will have, and this pandemic experience will have really significant long-term impacts on a range of policy and cultural issues, economic issues related to how we relate to each other at the workplace. For example, the reason I think that this is the case is that historians have always been super interested in the cultural changes wrought by the Industrial Revolution. Because what the Industrial Revolution did is bring a whole people out of rural environments where their lives were structured by the seasonal cycles, the lives were structured by daylight and nighttime, the lives were structured by how farms operate and so forth. They brought them into the city, and then they put them in factories. And in factories, it's just a completely different operating environment where you are working outside the home, significantly far outside the home. You're subject to a different type of discipline. You're following the clock rather than natural cycles and so forth. And there are huge cultural implications from that. There are huge implications about inequality. There are huge implications about the shape of cities. We, I think, are seeing a change on that scale. And if you think about the implications for inequality, for instance, and Gideon, I know you've been very interested in this yourself, because all of white collar Australia has basically been able to just move home, hop on Zoom. A huge amount of the non-white collar population has either been required to go to work in environments that aren't necessarily safe for them, which is, we're talking about some of the abattoirs and so forth, where a lot of the COVID outbreaks have been, or if you're in retail, you've either been furloughed or sacked.
Well, sorry.
This is an interesting. Sorry, go on, Gideon.
No, look, you've nailed it. And I was going to say the worst, the people who admittedly have to work in unsafe conditions are relatively lucky. Not as lucky as the first cohort, but to come back to my point, this is what has been one of the most frustrating, maddening, and I think quite twisted things about this whole pandemic and the government response to it, because the belief in lockdowns, the belief in staying home, the fact that we have people yelling at people over social media and even in person, stay the F home, the social distance warriors in this whole terrible saga tend to be people who are unaffected by the pandemic. There tend to be people, frankly, like myself, who can spend 4 months at home and the monotony might get a little bit much. But generally speaking, I'm dealing okay with lockdown. In fact, in some ways, I'm quite enjoying it. I get to, I've had more sleep, I think, than at any point in my adult life, because I can roll out of bed at 8:45 and my commute consists of a walk to my desk with my vape pen in my hand.
And none of the pubs are open. So
well, yeah. Well, my bank balance hasn't looked this good either on that note. But I can go and sit at home in my bathrobe with Sky on the background and continue working basically as I normally have. The people who are most enthusiastic about lockdowns,
we need to find you a smoking jacket. I can picture you in a smoking jacket.
Oh well,
silk brocade smoking jacket.
Well, the Chris Kringle's the Chris Kringle will probably be over bloody Zoom as well at this rate, so it'll be FedExed.
I'll see what I can do.
But I think there's something really, really wrong with a society where certain people are lucky and get to continue their lives as normal, and they are dictating the terms of basically a great national house arrest for people who aren't in that position. In particular, my heart has bled through this whole ordeal for hospitality workers who tend to be younger, who tend to not apply for qualify for JobKeeper. Not that that's a perfect solution because they haven't been on for long enough. And in particular, small business people, owner-operators, people who've mortgaged their house to start a bar and a cafe and a restaurant, they are being painted as the selfish ones, people who want to keep their businesses open. These are the people being portrayed as granny killers, whereas the real selfish ones are people who are collecting, in many cases, their same salary while get to enjoy sort of a lifestyle sitting at home lollygagging all day over Zoom. I think that's what's really gotten to me. So that's sort of a side effect of this, and it's exacerbated the divide between knowledge workers and white collar workers and the affluent inner city, kombucha guzzling denizens of Brunswick from people out there in the outer suburbs and in the country who are doing it genuinely tough, and it's a sad indictment on the country.
But Gideon, what do you think the long-term implications of that are? So the pandemic will end, and retail will open again, and bars and pubs will open again, and there'll be a lot of devastation because, of course, businesses have gone out. But in 2 or 3 years, the economy, or at least it'll be legal for the economy to look like it does now. But what we know about unemployment for young people straight out of school and straight out of university is that has if you enter the job market in a recession, that has implications for your lifetime earnings. You earn less than you do if you enter the job market in the good times. What do you think the long-term implications of this unequal allocation of burden will be? Do you foresee long-term inequality challenges? How do you think of that?
Well, again, I think it just will exacerbate political polarisation. I think it will widen the divide between the chattering classes and people who produce, because a lot of people at home on Zoom aren't working real jobs in any productive sense. A lot of them are people who update the Facebook page for a major corporation or something like that. On a political level, I hope it will, and this is something I've been talking about for a while, mainstream Australians, quiet Australians, call them what you will. I think it is beyond time that cohort of people develop what the left call class consciousness. I would hope that among those people in particular who the history of quiet Australians can be more apathetic or less of an activist than people who live in inner cities with too much time on their hands. I would hope that it brings home the great societal and personal harm that the state can do for no good reason. But I think this is heading, and I've made a lot of comparisons between the interwar period and the current juncture we're at, where you're either a nationalist or a socialist. I think the other outcome could be veering into Bernie Sanders style socialism. I think terrible things happen politically when segments of the population aren't doing well financially and unemployment is rife. And the 21st century Great Depression we have triggered better be worth it.
The only thing is, I'm not quite sure I'm totally on board with the scenarios that you painted, Chris, and therefore the reaction that Gideon's talking about between the anywheres and the somewheres, because this is not sustainable. This is the other thing. So knowledge workers definitely have had the better of this. And public sector knowledge workers, best of all. Victoria, they just got a 2% pay rise. Just unbelievable. But here we are. It's all very well for Google to say that they'll keep it in perpetuity, but as the Wall Street Journal puts it, the work from home experiment stretches on, but some cracks are starting to emerge. Projects take longer. Training is tougher. Hiring and integrating new employees more complicated. Some employers say their workers appear less connected, and bosses fear that younger professionals aren't developing at the same rate as they would in offices, sitting next to colleagues and absorbing how to do their jobs. This is not going to be sustainable, says Chief Executive of Humu and former HR Chief at none other than Google. There is going to be a backlash to this, Chris. It can't just stretch on. In many ways, the best way to predict the future is to say that it will in fact look like the past. I'm not so sure that this is a rupture equivalent to the industrial relation in the way of working. It is something that's happened. We tried to make it work. Here at the IPA, we've done it like anybody else, and we've tried to be upbeat about it. But the longer it goes on, the more you see the downsides. Any company which actually has a bottom line, and i.e. not public sector, will feel this and will start will create a dynamic to say we need to get back to it. How would you hire a graduate and bring them on board and train them up in this climate?
Yeah.
I think that's right, Scott, but I don't think so. It's not a binary question, right? So it's not like you're all at the office or you're all at home. And as we've discussed, this is a huge problem for bringing on junior staff. So to speak again to the point, even if in a full white collar environment, it is really, really hard to mentor new staff here. It's going to make those younger staff, it's going to make their career progression harder. It's going to hit ultimately, it's going to hit their lifetime earnings quite significantly just because of the nature of what we are. But at the same time, we have all suddenly realized the possibilities of at least part of the work from home model. And while there is a productivity hit that is obviously going to be the case, because otherwise we would have been at home. Otherwise, we've also dealt with it far better than we would have expected if you'd been told in January we're going to shut the economy down and everybody go work from home. I think we've all learned something. People are going to start demanding more capacity to work from home. I think managers are going to be more accepting of work from home structures, and that I think is going to have really interesting long-term consequences for the shape of the city, for the shape of the suburbs, for transport patterns, for all sorts of things that are really hard to predict right now, but will have really long-term effects. This has been an accelerating crisis, and we're going to find out what it is that accelerated us to.
Chris, I don't see that really at all. I think there'll be a reaction or a snapback on this. I think pieces like the one from the Wall Street Journal that'll appear on the show notes show that working from home isn't what it's cracked up to be. I think people are over working from home. Again, I don't mind it so much, but the monotony gets to me some days. I would hope that what this does is bring about a change in the corporate culture, particularly at large companies, and it brings down the HR industrial complex. I have been a long-term skeptic of bloated HR departments, having seen them at a previous place I worked at, there were about 20 of them. God knows what they did all day other than making people miserable and sporting stupid ideas about every stupid fad, from hot desking to work from home is something that's been trumped up for a while. Flexi time and all sorts of other things. I think we'll reach a realisation that Melissa Mayer reached when she took over as CEO of Yahoo in 2012, and then in 2013 she announced that there was no more working from home because there are certain things that you can't get, or a lot of things that you can't get over a Zoom connection. And something I've realised, I think one thing that come out of this is that people's relationships with their employers have changed. I think people will want to get that back on an even keel. I mean, I have great bosses, present company included, here at the IPA, but there is a very different dynamic from taking phone calls, once or twice a day to get your marching orders or to talk about a piece of work you've done, without the small talk, without the body language and facial expressions, without the camaraderie, without the mentoring. I mean, without the asides about other things that could be working on, without what I love about working at this place, which is when John Roskin pulls you into his office to ponder something, which usually goes for about 45 minutes to an hour, and you can talk about the subject matter of what you have to talk about, but then go back and forth.
And a bunch of other things.
And a bunch of other things at the same time. I mean, that in a think tank, I guess, in the environment we're in, there has to be a tank. There has to be this dynamic. This is how,
and in a business context, that's how innovation happens.
Correct.
Through those discussions. It's like, I can't figure out what this customer wants. Nothing I give him is working. She keeps saying no, and it's like, and then you talk about it for 2 hours, and you actually realise that the customer knows more about the cutting edge than you do, and you've actually got to lift your game and come up with a new product to meet their needs, and that's how innovation happens. I think this current environment is in lockdown. Mark 1 was really just stagnation. It's like, the famous story of the Ottomans. The Swiss presented their clocks and gave them the technology how to make clocks in the 17th century, and they went back 100 years later and the Ottomans were making exactly the same clocks.
Yep.
That's the environment we're in at the moment. It is not something that creates forward movement which will ever see society and business and markets progress again. So I think there will be a snapback because there just has to be.
And in the interest of having the last word, I want to just go back to my point about the HR monstrosity, because I think this is important. I hope that we reverse not just fads around remote work and different hours and sort of that, but we go back on the HR orthodoxy of the past 10 or 20 years. We get rid of these stupid getting to know you games or team bonding exercises where you go out and bowling or something. We bring back off Friday night drinks. We bring back being, the idea you're in the office 9 to 5. I really think that the modern workplace is so, we get rid of these stupid morning teas for all manner of irrelevant causes nobody cares about. We need to bring back the tough, adrenaline-filled, exciting, dynamic, honest office where people can be open with each other as well and express themselves. I think there's a lot to be said from... There's a great short story called The Office Christmas Party about a debaucherous office Christmas party, but it's a bygone era, and I think we have... and this is an important point. You might think I'm just being a flippant drunk again, but this is the important point. There have been studies galore on loneliness, the loneliness epidemic, people feeling lonely, more isolated than ever before, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we cannot express ourselves as openly as we'd like to at work. And if you want to date somebody who happen to work with, that's a whole other can of worms. I think we need to stop over-sanitising the human condition. And a great place to start with doing that is at the office, where we spend the majority of our time in many cases, certainly during the week.
Thank you, Gideon.
Yeah.
That's a message to the IPA's.
The IPA is the exception, not the rule. I'm very lucky to work here because I've had I've worked in some hellholes before where exactly what I described is the daily reality.
Yep, there's a reason why we don't have an HR department.
Yeah.
So
I'd be in trouble if we did.
Speaking of the past, Gideon.
Yes.
Speaking of nostalgia for a more straightforward time. You've been catching up on an old television program.
Yeah, so this is my culture pick this week. I had a book in mind, but I thought we'd go with something a little bit more fun. So my girlfriend has only recently discovered Kath and Kim. So I've been binge watching the old episodes from the series they made in the early 2000s. And first of all, it's very funny. I don't like the sort of creative set's propensity to sneer at bogans and people like that, but I think this is done well. I don't think it's particularly mean-spirited. I think the characters are good-hearted enough to be relatable and for this to be a pretty good and entertaining show. And for those people that don't know, it chronicles the lives of Kath Day Knight, a sort of suburban middle-aged housewife in a fictitious outer suburb called Fountain Lakes, and her daughter
Kim
Craig. But what's fascinating about it is that when it was made, it was the early 2000s, and it really does chronicle and reflect the mythology of the cashed-up bogan. People who are living in nice houses, who have access to holidays and consumer electronics and fancier food and DVDs and things like that. But what the fascinating thing to watch it from a public policy perspective and from a cultural perspective is that it reflects an Australia that was lost, I think, when John Howard left the lodge. It harks back to a time in Australia when the only thing that the chattering classes and the naysayers had to complain about was there were too many tradies buying too many plasma screen TVs. I wish that was the only problem that people had to bang on about today. It's an extraordinary time. And I remember clear as a bell, because this is when I was in high school and first discovering politics, that there were essays written about cruise ship Australia, that we didn't have any ambitions beyond owning a home.
That was David Williamson.
Williamson,
Yeah.
He'd actually won a trip on a cruise ship and then wrote complaining about...
a sneering piece about how ordinary and terrible people were. So
ungrateful
this was a time in Australia that we had too much money and too much wealth. I mean, it's extraordinary how far we've slipped since. God knows we've got more problems than that these days. But it's amazing that... and that was the tension of the show, the fact that, Kath and Kim had, money and could afford to get on Jetstar flights to Bali and things like that and experience part of high culture and a bit of the world that they didn't quite understand in the show and weren't familiar with, and that was them making sense of this new world that had opened up. I think that's actually a great era in Australian society when people had the means to discover new things and broaden their horizons. And at the time, as I remember, and Chris, as you do too, as we were discussing before the show, that was the great irritant to the chattering classes that the people were too well off. It's an extraordinary historical
And
error.
it's actually very funny.
Yeah, it's a
And
funny
it is
show
very
too.
funny, but I fully endorse that, Gideon, because I've always found it's always flabbergasted me the idea that your critique or you've got a political critique based on an aesthetic dislike for people having things that you just don't like oh wow, your couch is too large or poorly colored, your TV is too big, your car is too big,
your house is a McMansion,
I don't like the design of your home, it's a McMansion, all that sort of stuff. And in the 2000s, that was a big part of the critique of John Howard's Australia. Suburban sprawl was boring, wasn't cultural like the inner city, all that sort of stuff. And I've always just found there's some left-wing critiques of politics or policy that I can at least understand. I cannot fathom anyone who is driven by that aesthetic view that the people who don't live my lifestyle must be, that's a policy problem.
But this is the true class divide in Australia. It's actually, it's not an economic thing, it's a sociological thing that suppose, for the average Marxist who thinks it's all about your economic class, the true class divide are the well-off knowledge workers, sneering essentially at the rising cashed-up Bogans. It's as old as capitalism. When the sumptuary laws were meant to put down the rising mercantile class and stop them dressing so nicely, and to make sure they didn't have nice houses and ride around in carriages. The way the nobility used to look down on the people who had less station in society but more money. And that's what we have now, except it's not a hereditary nobility. It's the educated upper middle class going out of its way. And the thing about this show that I do love, it really walks that fine line.
Correct.
You never quite
But it's
know.
not mean-spirited. That's the thing. It doesn't descend into...
that's what I mean. But it's
but it gets close.
It's having fun at their expense.
Correct.
And particularly their brilliant malapropisms.
Yeah.
But it's not really tipping it on them from a great height. Although it has been said that Kim Craig, Gina Riley did say she has no redeeming features whatsoever.
Oh no, she doesn't. But that's not because of her station in life. That's because she's just a terrible, awful person.
Yeah, it's her personality.
But and the fashions. I mean, the tops she wears and everything else, just a throwback to that era. But the final point I'll make is it says something about state power in John Howard's Australia as well, because chief among the complaints and the way that the chattering classes tried to rationalise their irritation with people who weren't as educated as they were was that. John Howard said he wanted everybody to be relaxed and comfortable. The country had no ambition. It didn't want to achieve anything. There was no, what it wanted to achieve was good living standards for its people, through which they could achieve their dreams and goals, which I think is a pretty lofty ideal. But the coda to that was when we got the Kevin Rudd 2020 summit, which was almost the great reaction of the John Howard era, which is bringing these, the best and brightest, the best minds and sundry lunatics into Canberra to come up with new ideas for how state power could be used to achieve great lofty national ambitions, whatever they may be. It was a real philosophical turning point, which I think resonates today in the role of the state and the role of the state in driving a country forward towards various goals. And as a result, of course, we got pages and pages of stupid ideas, none of which were actually implemented other than, I think, a new ABC children's channel. ABC Me, and Pink Bats, and look how well that turned out. So, Kath and Kim, great piece of Australia, and I highly recommend it.
All those brain surgeons, and no one predicted that in 2020 we'd be in a lockdown due to a pandemic. So what a waste of time that was. Chris, what's your culture pick for this week?
Sure. So I have been reading Anne Applebaum's book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. It's quite new. It came out last week or the week before or something along those lines. Anne Applebaum may be well known to listeners. She wrote a magnificent history of the Soviet Gulag. She's done a lot of historical writing on Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and the Cold War and so forth.
And the Ukrainian famine,
Ukrainian famine, so the Holodomor, which we spoke about last week with Mr. Jones, the movie. But this is a super interesting book for reasons that we've touched on a lot on this podcast. So the book is about the current generation of populists and nationalists in the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, and Hungary, and casting that as a surprising reaction to the sort of classical liberal consensus of the 1990s and 2000s, of which Anne Applebaum clearly associates herself with. And she's looking at the people that she used to spend a lot of time with in the conservative movement, conservative intellectuals in Eastern Europe and the Anglosphere, and how some of them, not all of them, have been converted to the cause of nationalist populism or nationalist conservatism or conservative nationalism, or however you might describe it. Now, this is a very short book. She's very clearly opposed to conservative nationalism or nationalist conservatism, and she's very opposed to some of the really big events like the election of Donald Trump and and Brexit and so forth. She's particularly critical of Viktor Orban. I recommend people read it, not because they'll necessarily agree with it, and I don't agree with everything. I think there's strong liberal cases, for instance, for the classical liberal cases for Brexit and so forth.
And Trump.
So I slightly disagree less than that, but nonetheless, and I think there's a classical liberal case for Boris Johnson and all this sort of stuff. But nonetheless, it's a really interesting book. I will point out one thought that I had while I was reading it, though. The thing that she's really interested in is the interrelationships between the populist conservatives around the world. So the way that social media and new media technologies have allowed the Polish, the Hungarian, the American, the British populists to coordinate, to view themselves as allies. There's a sort of transnational nationalist movement, which is really weird for a bunch of reasons, not just on the face of it, but historically nationalist movements have been really at loggerheads with each other because the interests of nationalists historically has been, for instance, disputes about where a border should be, what country deserves control of this certain population or this group or what have you. So this generation of conservative nationalists or nationalist conservatives is quite different in that there's a new ideology growing up that's primarily around things like immigration, primarily around things like trade, that is quite distinct, I think, from the nationalisms of the 19th and the 20th century. Readers won't agree with everything in this book, and I don't agree with everything in this book, but it is a super interesting and super explicit stepping back from by someone who has completely declined to make the change to populism over the last 5 years.
Yeah, I did read some reviews of it. It's also, again, I don't agree with the whole thesis, and I think she's naive to be so surprised at the social implications of the new alignments in politics. So she's married, as I understand it, to one of the opposition politicians in Poland, and she's sort of genuinely shocked that the people who used to be her friends when there was a Cold War coalition, an alliance of classical liberals, conservatives, and anti-communist socialists, were part of a broader movement to defeat communism in Eastern Europe, and now we have a completely different alignment, and that old coalition has fallen apart, and she finds herself on the opposite side of politics and is shocked and appalled that she doesn't get invited to people's dinner parties anymore. And some of these people even go off and work for the Polish government, which even though she finds reprehensible. I think that's really sort of a bit of an elite sort of complaint, which perhaps she projects too far into that this is something new in the world of politics. So
well, what she's talking about is intra-elite competition. So she's talking about the intellectuals that made a choice to pick one side on the nationalist populist debate. And she's shocked that so many of her former friends chose to become nationalist populists. Now, you might say that's naive. You might say
I just did.
Yeah. I mean, Scott might argue. But nonetheless, this is not a elites versus the mainstream story. This is elites versus other elites. And this is an intellectual class that chose to go one way or another.
What are the fault lines, Chris, in relation to public policy issues and actual outcomes? I mean, to me, the nationalist versus globalist debate comes in a lot of ways down to governance. Should we farm out parts of our decision making to bodies like the EU? Should we trust a strong leader versus a rolling talk fest of self-proclaimed experts and so on? I mean, what's her beef with specific outcome? And admittedly, I don't know a lot about Orban's government. I know it's a mixed bag to say the least with outcomes there. But what is it she's upset about in terms of reform and what's changing in the world and in Europe?
Well, there are policy distinctions, and immigration is one of the clearest instances of that. But I think it's more general than that, and it's the book is called the Twilight of Democracy, right? The seductive lure of authoritarianism. And what she's critical of, or what she believes has happened, is that a lot of people have a lot of intellectuals have, like intellectuals historically, have identified that strong leaders, as you describe them, who are capable of reducing not democracy per se, but not like the act of voting, but the things that go along with democracy, like free and pluralist press, open debate, access to justice, all these sort of things, part of the rich fabric of democracy that's more than just passing a ballot. And she's concerned that a lot of intellectuals, because they now see someone powerful who's in charge, who they agree with on policy matters, it's just time to ram it down the throats of the enemies, back the authoritarian leader. Now, if that's the case, if her diagnosis is the case, that is a super normal thing to happen, right? Because intellectuals have always done this.
Correct. It's not a new thing. I was just thinking
always back the worst leaders.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
By almost definition. But she's drawing, her argument is to say that Viktor Orban and the Polish Law and Justice Party are, to the extent that they are anti-democratic and they're trying to close off independent media and all that sort of thing, then the Brexit movement and the Trump movement are of a similar type, if not a similar extent. Now, I think it falls down the further you get away from Eastern Europe, but that's the argument that she's making.
Yep.
Yeah, Brexit I don't understand, quite frankly. I don't see how... I can see how people don't like it, and can see, I see the arguments about global cohesion and lessons learned from the World War II and all sorts of other things. But I don't see how the UK withdrawing from the European Union automatically plunges it into a new state of authoritarianism. It just, to me, that doesn't make... Well,
I don't think that's quite... I take a point, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's stretched too far.
Yeah.
But yeah, we perhaps learn some perspective from these books. That's the spirit in which I've approached this book, which I mentioned on the podcast in recent weeks, which is Running Against the Devil, A Plot to Save America from Trump and Democrats from Themselves, by Rick Wilson, who's one of the co-founders of the Lincoln Project. So these are Never Trumpers, Gideon. And this is he's a former campaign operator for the Republicans, more on the advertising side, I think, using research to construct hard-hitting ads to skewer the Democrats, as he says. He's been doing it for a long time. I've been thinking about how to talk to this book, because a bit like Anne Applebaum's, Chris, I read it with great interest without necessarily agreeing with the whole thing. I think it's mainly something that should be read as being quite an amusing comedy, really, if the issues weren't so important, because it's written as a series of insults to the Democrat Party for being unable to see how the Republicans have been cutting their lunch ever since 1980, essentially. With the exception of Barack Obama. They got George Bush elected twice. They've always managed to paint the Democrats into a corner as being on issues like abortion and socialism and being weak on foreign affairs. And the Democrats walk into it every time.
Oh, well, what about Bill Clinton?
Well,
I'm a bit of a closet Clinton fan.
Well, that was...
I like Bill Clinton.
Yeah, well, who did he rely on for his advice?
Well, that's true.
Dick Morris, the former Republican operator.
That's true, and also a lot of it was driven by Newt Gingrich and the House GOP. So, yeah.
That's right. So...
fair point.
In a nutshell, the advice, and it goes on a bit, the advice is this should be a referendum about Trump, that you really only have two demographic audiences to think about. The first is the white working class, and basically to say, you voted for Trump in 2016, how did that work out for you? Because you can, get them back in Ohio, Pennsylvania, even Idaho, states like that. Don't accept that they're now rusted onto Trump. These were people who voted Democrat in the past. And the other is suburban women. And the polling does suggest that Trump does have a problem there. He said, make it a referendum on Trump and you will win, is his message to the Democrats. And he said, but the Democrats, he said, they can't get out of their own way, is what he repeatedly says. They'll focus all their attention on states like California, where they're going to win anyway. They're going to get the Electoral College votes. He goes through the states. Basically, there's only 15 that matter, and anyone who says you spend 1 cent in anything other than Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Virginia, Arizona, and Minnesota, Wisconsin, Colorado, Iowa, Nevada, Maine, and New Hampshire, it's a complete waste of money. They're the 15 states you need to focus on to get to that Electoral College majority. But the reason why it's funny, of course, is he describes all the ways that the Democrats will stuff this up. And this edition, I believe there's a new edition coming out, was written before they settled on Joe Biden. And for instance, one of his tactics is, you can see Trump's evident cognitive decline. The Democrats should just challenge Trump to take
I'd like to see a referendum on that.
Yeah. So it's like, oh my God, they had this beautiful thing they could have run on against Trump, but they went and pre-selected Joe Biden.
But they have chosen the nothing candidate, right? So Joe Biden, yes, he's not all there, but he is the nothing candidate. No one has particularly strong feelings about Joe Biden whatsoever outside.
He's in the middle.
So who's going to get out?
So they have chosen basically the zeroth candidate they could.
They did,
but how's that an advantage? Who's going to go roll out of bed and go in the snow to vote?
No. But the point,
no one. The entire. The Rick Wilson point I think is entirely correct. Now, that the election is and will always be about Trump, in part because Trump has no other way to engage with the public than through talking about himself. All the Democrats have to do is just wait it out.
But they also
Joe Biden, who is asleep, is the perfect candidate for that.
Yeah, but then to get the vote out, what they need is the ground game.
Yeah.
So which he does talk about at some length about how they actually do that and why the
Republicans... You can vote for someone or you can vote against someone, and I think the Democrat strategy is probably the optimal one from their perspective, which is that they think there's enough people who just hate the president that that will get enough and would just vote for a sandwich. A sandwich doesn't need ground game.
I think
they just need to hate the president.
I think with respect to yourself and to the author of the book, I think that's history doesn't show that. I think that to defeat an incumbent president, you need somebody with star power. You need a Ronald Reagan or a Bill Clinton, and even Bill Clinton was assisted with the third party candidate. Who was it? Ross Perot. I don't see Biden. Biden barely has the ability to tie shoelaces, let alone any sort of discernible charisma. And George W. Bush was loathed in 2004 widely by a lot of people and a reasonably controversial president at the time, and he won quite comfortably against John Kerry, who makes Joe Biden look like George Washington.
And it also feeds the narrative, and this is his point: is the GOP are very good at campaigning. They'll stop at nothing. There's a lot of diatribe against Trump. Trump will stop at nothing, and the very fact that they put a sock puppet like Biden there will allow the GOP to say, well, behind Biden is Ocasio-Cortez or Nancy Pelosi, is it Bernie Sanders. You're going to get socialism anyway. You're going to vote for Biden, but you'll get socialism and the end of the Constitution and your right to bear arms and all these things. So that'll essentially be the GOP message, and they'll fasten on any of that. And he said the people that will blow up the campaign, of course, are people like Ocasio-Cortez, because the only two people, he said there are only two groups of people that believe that masses of Americans are just waiting for the socialist revolution. The first is the left wing of the Democrats, and the other is the right wing of the Republicans. And they both believe it, and they'll both get exercised on it, and they'll both vote it. But if the GOP can do that, then they will win, and Trump will win. So even though it's actually made me doubt the polls. And even though they're running against Trump at the moment, the more I read of this, it's the opposite of what Rick Wilson's saying. I think the Democrats will actually stuff this up.
Oh, yeah, 40 states. That's my pick. 40. Trump will carry 40 states and win.
You heard it here first.
You can replay that Peter Van Onselen style if you want.
Yep, very good. What did he say?
He said Scott Morrison can't win, and I'm happy for people to replay this over and over again in the Twitter sphere.
They oblige.
I'm happily obliged. Yeah, correct.
They happily oblige. Okay, Mitch, can you just make a note of the time when Gideon said 40 states, and we'll run a book closer to the event.
And for the punters among us, jump on your betting app. There are some great odds to be had. Bet bigly on Trump.
Well, there you go.
Go all in,
This is not financial advice, etc., etc.
Oh, yeah. Consult your financial planner and bookie.
And bet responsibly. Very good. No, thank you, Gideon, for that culture pick, and Chris for yours. A reminder to our listeners that Looking Forward is a product of the Institute of Public Affairs, made possible only by our wonderful 6,000 plus members and the donations that come in to support our research. If you want to check that out, please do go to our website, and that's also where you'll find links to the various things that we've discussed in this show. I'd like to thank Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott.
Gideon Rozner.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Mitch in the studio, and to you for listening. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.